Um, okay, well, hi everybody. In case for those who weren't here yesterday, in case you don't know me already, my name is Marjorie Alain. I am the Director of Communications at PEP. And today's session, I will host today's session together with Jenny Herwood, who's our communications officer and the real communications expert in our
Right.
team. Um, So this is the second of a three-session workshop. Yesterday we talked mainly about the need to contextualize scientific evidence um, in policy making, and today the focus of today is really to translate a research result into a policy argument. My part, or I will start with the first half, and I'm my focus is basically how to address questions that policymakers have. Focus how to focus on what they really need to know, and then Jenny will take over halfway through to help you really define your policy messages from your research result and organize them in a um, communication communication way, how to organize them for a greater effect. So I think that um, one I like yesterday I use expert quotes to really speak my mind, to say what I mean. I think their words are better than mine. And one of them was I took from a YouTube video from Oxford. Um, it was an interview with a guy working at the UK Parliamentary Office, and he's really at the interface between science and policy. And basically, his conclusion is that yes, policy makers need to do science better. They need to consider science more, but on the other hand, scientists, for this to work, scientists also need to do policy better, meaning that they have to consider policy needs, um, and sort of step out of their own um, incentives and way of doing things to see things from the policy perspective. So I thought that was an interesting quote. And the second one I mentioned yesterday, I think it's an important one in communications, and it applies in any communication, in any situation where you need to communicate. It will work if the information you provide is the information that the people need, and you provide it in a form that they can use. And they can't have to translate it. um, it has to be digestible, has to be usable now. So that's a little bit what we're trying to do with this workshop. Try to translate your science advice, your message, into a policy input. Right. So for this to be able to do that, we need to know what we need to talk about what policymakers really need to know. And oops, sorry. And I want to start with this. For those who were in Sally, you've seen this graph before. Basically, um, the right side, the policy side, is a little bit the same as the circle that I showed yesterday and that you have in your exercise, the 5 stages of policy making. Um, and the main problem, from my understanding, from my experience so far, in trying to get research to inform policy, is that the problem at the basis is that the question that the researchers ask at the beginning of a research project is not the same as the question that the policy cycle asks at the beginning. So you have a research problem is not the same as a policy problem. And so when you get to the end, it's difficult when you get with a product, a scientific product, it's difficult to translate into a policy input because the question at the onset was not the same. And often the researcher will ask a question without necessarily considering the policy questions that the end result or the evidence will serve to inform. And as we talked yesterday, the research can be used or intervene at different stages of the policy cycle. It can be assimilated at different stages of the cycle, but you need to know exactly what the use is to be able to at least communicate your product in the right way. You also need to know when it needs to be used and how it needs to be used and who will use it to be able to communicate it effectively. So let's start with the problem. The policy question versus the research question. These are two different things. And of course, ideally, a research question should be asked, so the research process or project should start in full awareness of the policy question that the evidence is meant to inform. Now, if this has been done, obviously in an experimental impact evaluation project, it's more concrete. I mean, you are working with an existing program or policy, so that's easy to feed. But generally speaking, when you're asking your research question to make sure the evidence will be useful as an input, you should wonder from the start what is the current policy question I need to answer. But for now, we're at the end of the cycle. When you communicate it, it's still important to remember what is the policy question that you're trying to answer, so that when you communicate it as an answer that can be used, it can be perceived as something useful by the policymaker. So it's important to distinguish what the difference between your research question and the policy question that you're trying to answer. Because if you communicate your research evidence just as the product of your research question, it might not seem like it's a good fit in the policy decision framework. Well, no, let me go back. Just one thing. The difference between the two mainly is that the research is descriptive. It's an assessment of a situation, whereas policy questions are focused on their actions, they're action oriented. What can we do to improve things? If I'm just gonna launch something out there, if I ask this question, what are the effects of non-farm diversification on rural women's income? Could someone tell me if this is a research or a policy question? Anyone in the room? Or I can just ask someone. Joshua, for example. Joshua, can you tell me?
Yes.
Yes. Can you tell me if you think this one is a research question or a policy question?
For me, I think it's a research question because it's not attached to action.
Yeah, exactly.
It's more kind to assess what are they.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a research question, is to define, is to assess a situation, describe a situation. Whereas this one, what type of intervention can effectively contribute to improving rural women's income, that would be more action oriented. It is they want to know what they can do. So that's a policy question. So always remember that the answer you're providing is meant to inform a decision regarding an action. If I compare the two, and then we ask ourselves, will this research help inform the actual policy question. Someone is researching or analyzing the effects of non-farm diversification on rural women's income. Is it sufficient to inform the policy decision regarding what type of intervention can they implement? Basically, I think it's easy to realize that this is one option. And when a policymaker has to define an intervention, they usually have more than one option to choose from. So a research will focus on one aspect of an issue, whereas policy has to consider all dimensions and all possible decision and the effects of each decision. They need to compare the pros and cons of the different decisions they could make. So the question is this the right question? To know that, we need to know if this is one option being considered or that could be considered by the government. Is this something the government could support, non-farm diversification, if obviously the results are positive? And we also need to know how will the policymakers assess or compare this option with other options? What will be the criteria on which they will base this comparison, this evaluation or assessment of which one is the best? Government are, I mentioned this yesterday, the performance of governance is measured by its responsiveness to societal demands, the effectiveness of their action in achieving the desired goals, and also their efficiency. So achieving goals at the lowest possible cost, or actually using resources adequately. There's also a lot of constraints related to feasibility that will have to be considered. Is it applicable? Is it realistic? There's legal feasibility. Is it doable? Is it something we can legally do? Administrative and technical. Do we have the means? Do we have the manpower? Can this be put in place and implemented? And finally, the social and cultural feasibility. Will this be accepted by the population, by the beneficiaries? If a recommendation is inapplicable in regards to these different aspects, it will be considered, it will affect your credibility as an advisor. If you come with a recommendation that's evidence-based, but it's completely inapplicable, it won't be considered worth much in the eyes of those who were supposed to use it. And so while we force a little bit to produce policy recommendations based on your evidence, it's important to make sure that the recommendation you're sharing or you're communicating is applicable. I think I've shown this before also, if your evidence is not, it seems like it doesn't seem to fit in the policy decision framework, it won't be considered valuable. So it has to be positioned in a broader context. So that's what the policy paper was about, right? You have your research paper and you have a result. Now this result, we have to know how it fits in the puzzle, how it fits in the, and so if you want to communicate effectively, you'll have to put it in context. And the context involves priorities and key considerations by the policymaker. These are the criteria that will be used to assess good policy. The standard criteria, we can discuss it, but criteria can change from one place to another. It's important to understand your own context, as I was saying yesterday, to know what are the priorities of the people you were talking to. To succeed in any debate, if you're going to pitch something in any context, and that includes advising policy, you always have to be aware of the alternative proposals on the table. What will be the objections? What will be the counter argument? Who's proposing something else? Well, not who, but what are they proposing? So that you have an idea of how to compare. You also need to know what will be used to compare them, to compare their relative strengths of the different options. So that's often, well, science has the advantage of bringing new information that wasn't known before, and also to provide reliable information to government. And that can be a very powerful argument. If you come with information that comes from a reliable place, a source that they can be trusted, and especially if you shed light on question marks that used to have. Here I compare, you have option 1, option 2, for example, the unknown was the effect on equity, and you bring that new information. It's an important one, but it has to be put in context with the other criteria as well. Cost, I've mentioned, I'll talk about this. Cost is often a very important criteria that researchers don't, even economists don't consider. So yeah, so that's the key considerations is what I'm leaning towards. What do policymakers care about? If you communicate a policy recommendation, what will be the aspects of this policy that you have to emphasize on? You may also have seen this before. The usual criteria to assess good policy in a very general way, it's are these ones. There are others depending on your context. You should know about them, but it's impossible to list them all. Here, I think we can just focus on these two groups. The first one is effects, the effectiveness of an action, the intended and unintended effects, and also the equity aspect. How will an action or a policy intervention affect different groups differently? So that's something that research usually address well. That's the information that you can usually provide to decision makers, and that's very valuable. But a policy will not be assessed only based on effectiveness. It will also be assessed based on its applicability, and these are the criteria that are usually overlooked in a piece of research, and even in the communication from the scientist to the policymaker. What are the costs and the budget implications of this action that you're proposing? Is it viable? Is it feasible? Is it realistic, basically? If you don't have information about this, is it acceptable also by the populace? If you don't have information about this, ideally you should find it. If you really can't find it, then you should be honest about it, that you don't know whether or not it's feasible or acceptable. But the claim about your recommendation should be toned down a little bit if you don't know these aspects. It's important to focus that you know about the effectiveness, but you didn't have the information to compare the cost effectiveness, for example. And that's probably even more important than effectiveness alone. The government will choose the action that will achieve the highest possible outcome, but in a most efficient way, so relative to the cost and the investment. Right. So that's that's what I was saying. So effectiveness, especially coming from economists, should be considered when you communicate with them. That's the difference between communicating research results is focusing on one option and its different aspects, and you usually providing information about effects, and communicating evidence-informed policy advice. Evidence-informed policy advice, the actual policy advisor will be able to compare the pros and cons between different options for action. It's not necessarily possible to research all of it, and that's, you may say it's not your role. You as a researcher, you're focused on one intervention and its effect and unintended, non-intended, or equity effects, and that's great. It's valuable information, but it is in itself, it's not sufficient. It needs to be compared. So if you go that step forward, if you go that extra mile, I would say, you'll have more credibility as a policy advisor, and you'll be called again. It's not possible to research everything, and usually if you try to provide information about every single possible aspect, it will be considered too heavy. You should know about the strengths and weaknesses in several criteria, but I guess the key is to focus on the priorities. Identify which of these criteria are the most important to the person you're talking to. And then when you do that, you focus on, when you have identified those, you focus on those and you provide information about that. You can have the rest of the information and backup and background, but in your message, you highlight those. You know, these are the most important criteria for them. You focus on those in the core of your message. And if they want to find out more, they probably give it to their subsidiary. You can provide more when it comes, when they ask, I mean. And yes, well, that's the idea of what I'm saying since the beginning. You have to contextualize your research, show how your research is coming in to inform the decision framework, the comparison, the assessment of the different option. So show how it's valuable because it fills key knowledge gaps. And also you have to, well, to be able to do that, you'll have to know from the start what was the actual policy questions that your evidence can help answer. I've saw this before. So your research was about this. You can find out about, ideally, if you can try to find out about the other options. Your research focuses on one option. If you can find out about the other options through consultations and literature, you should be able to back your claims as well. Provide, when you communicate your results, and if you are able to compare it with the other options based on the same criteria, back your claims. Use sources, and ideally trusted sources that they already know, to support your claims with as much evidence as possible, although you don't want to make your text heavy with lots of references. Number it, make it clear, but be ready to show that you have evidence to back up your claims. And finally, information on costs. There may be information out there available, but you are economists, and you should, if you can find information on the cost of different options, you can analyze it to produce a cost benefit analysis. Even a rough one will be valuable. It's very rare that actually thorough cost benefit analysis are produced. in government, to be honest, but there will always be some kind of cost benefit analysis before any option is considered. So if you can provide information on cost, that would be, and cost and versus benefits, that would be very very powerful, a very powerful argument. And that's what your policy paper was about, basically. It was not meant to be easy or out of your head. It was supposed to involve more research, consultations, literature review, but different from the one of your research project, because now we're talking about gray literature. We're talking about information that's available from regarding the outside of the scope of your research. Right. So I think that's my last part. Basically, when you're preparing a message to policymakers, you should try to think about what it is that they want to know, what it is that they need to know, so that you can focus on you can make your communication and answer their question. And here I have examples of, according to one man who has a lot of experience in doing this, advising government from the science side. He says that in his experience, the questions that decision makers will always have are the following: why do we have to do something now? Why is it a priority? Why is this issue important? Remember what I said before yesterday: if you're coming in with a new problem, and if you only have your research to as backup to, or as evidence to prove that it's a very important problem, and especially if you're presenting a problem without a solution, it won't be picked up. They have too many problems already. You have to be very convincing that this presents a risk for them not to act on. So that's the first. The second is, have we got the option that meets our broader needs? And broader needs is important here. It means it's not just effectiveness, it's also who does it affect, the equity aspect, and how does it compare with other options? Is it doable? So have we got the option that meets our broader needs? You have to present your recommendation as an option, which it is. And finally, what will it cost? Again, that's a very, very important question of government. If you have information about cost, you should also be able to compare it with benefits. So cost versus benefits presented as an investment rather than just a spending. So knowing that these are the questions that decision makers always have, it's sort of a safe bet if you prepare your policy messages focused on while keeping these questions in mind. Another important aspect about the when you present your problem, because part of your message will always be there is a problem that we need to solve, right? If you want to present a problem, try to link it as much as possible with current issues. Context matters. The government will have interest in issues that are important now, either through the media, public perceptions, their own commitments as part of the electoral cycle, and the issues are important for their own constituents. Right. If you have, I didn't realize I discovered it. So if you are talking about the options, you need to know what the other options are on the table. And especially if you are talking about the effects, focus on the effects that will affect their priority stakeholders. Show how the problem and the solution can affect either negatively or positively their priority stakeholders. Find out who these people are, who is priority, and link your information with them. And as economists, you cannot afford to seem unaware of cost implications of your policy recommendation. So that's it for me. I round it up now, and I'm letting Jenny Herwood take over on how to prepare your policy message and structure them in an effective way. So Jenny,
Hello. Yes, I'm taking over now. Hopefully that wasn't too much of an interruption.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I cut it short a little bit, but I didn't see the end coming.
That's okay. You can see my screen now.
I guess, is that yours? Yeah. Yep.
Yes.
Good.
Okay. So, as Marjorie said, I'm going to be talking about organizing and defining your key messages. So, Marjorie explained that the content or type of information from your project that you need to share with policymakers. And I will talk about more specifically how to present that information to reach your audience. So throughout this session, oops, there we go. Throughout this session and the rest of tomorrow's as well, I want you to keep your objectives in mind. Sorry, I'm not used to having to click on things rather than just using the arrows. I will get the hang of this. I'm sorry. So the first thing is, why do you want to share your research? So it could be to inform upcoming policymaking, ongoing policymaking, or modify an existing program or policy. Are you advocating for a change? Are you advocating to keep a policy that they want to perhaps get rid of? So you're asking someone to take action. This could be quite general because they might not be the person that will be taking in the policy decision, but you might be asking them to share this information with their colleagues. That's still an action. You might be asking them to present or consider your findings as part of a committee discussion. Still an action. So that's a really key part of something that you really need to keep in mind throughout. And this is something that, of course, when you're talking to different people, you may have to change what you tell them slightly. The facts will be the same, but the way you address them might be differently. But we'll go into a bit more about that tomorrow. Today, I want to speak more generally about ways of presenting your key messages in a very clear and powerful way that will reach a number of people. So now that you have the answers to your questions, why you want to share your research and what you want your audience to do about it, you have to keep this in mind so that you can prioritize the message that is most relevant. In whichever type of presentation you're doing, you will always want to prioritize the message that is most relevant. So we're going to start by defining your key messages. Of course, your key messages depend on your analysis And tomorrow we will look in more detail about how to adapt your messages depending on your audience, as I said. And this is very much more the how-to for deciding on what your key messages should look like. So we want a good key message that is simple, attractive, concrete, and ideally, I'll come back to that. So simple, whenever you want to make a point, we want to keep it as simple as possible so that it's easier for your audience to understand and retain. You want it to be attractive because, as Marjorie discussed, and through the work you've done in your policy, in your project, with your stakeholder analysis and getting to know decision makers in your country, you will understand what is relevant to them and what they're interested in. So hopefully you will know the type of information that they will be attracted to, that will grab their attention. Sorry, is there a question I can't hear?
No, I just think someone had a microphone on.
Okay. But I should say that if you do have a question, please just interrupt me. So the final key criterion is that your message should be concrete. As Marjorie said, we're talking about changing policy, that we want to improve, you want to improve policies that are happening in your country. And so you need to tell your audience the action specifically that they should take. Oops. Okay. So the bonus that I almost said earlier is that it should be shareable. And if you achieve criteria 1 to 3, it probably will be. So the idea is that if you've got something that is straightforward and memorable and specific, that multiple policy actors can latch onto your message and share it in their circles, giving it a much greater chance of people retaining it and wanting to use it, seeing the value because they're aware of it. So how do you make a policy message simple? One idea, one sentence, plain language. We'll have a look at some examples in a minute, and that'll allow you to see whether you think that they're good or bad, or where their strengths and weaknesses are. But it's so important to use language that everyone can understand. I said that they should be attractive. So ideally, you're looking to explain that you are solving a problem that is important to the population and to your audience. So this, in theory, policymakers, they care about the population, but they will have priorities within that. Excuse me. And excuse me. Sorry, I'm not used to speaking so much. So ideally, the problem, this is something that you will have established in your research anyway, that the problem is something that is current, possibly even urgent. And this is something that you can highlight in your key messages. It should be concrete. So what do I mean by concrete? I mean that you're offering a specific and realistic solution, something that can be taken hold of and put in place. So we're going to have a look at a few different possible key messages taken from previous PEP projects. And I want to know whether you think it works with the criteria that I have set out. So I will invite you to just turn on your microphones and respond. So the first one is implementing policies that increase rural women's household and farm productivity alongside the Rural Electrification Fund capital subsidies for mini grid developers can increase women's income and household well-being. So, can someone tell me if it is simple, attractive, and concrete? Or you could just tell me a positive or perhaps a negative point.
It's a mouthful.
Yes, it is a mouthful. I definitely would not want to be trying to present that in a spoken situation. So I would say that it's complex, that there's a lot of information that's coming. So we're talking about rural women's household, but also farm productivity and the Rural Electrification Fund subsidies, but specifically for mini grid developers. So there's a lot of information going on there. Yes, we've got a comment in the chat saying that there is too much detail. Do we have any other issues, or are there any positives in this? Does anyone want to offer an opinion? You can speak in English or French. We have interpretation. If you wish to speak in French, please feel free to do so, and we'll ask those listening in English just to switch to the English channel. Okay, maybe you'll be less shy for the next one. Yeah, sorry. So I would like to point out one positive. Yes, Joshua, did you?
Yeah, I did not say, I think the sentence is hard to memorize. It's too long.
Definitely.
So it's very hard to memorize after reading it. You have to read it twice to get the message.
Oh, exactly. Yes, you have to read it several times to understand what we're saying. The other thing is that it's not really that concrete. It just says policies that increase women's household and farm productivity. But what are these policies? We don't know from this message. It's not something that you can just implement directly. I mean, I understand that you can't just implement policies just like that, but at least you should know what type of policy we're talking about. However, we're talking about increasing women's income and household well-being. And this is right there in the top message. So at least we know that this is a current issue. I would say that that's the positive in this message, is that it addresses a current policy concern. Let's try another one. Land reform to increase women's access to agricultural land can improve food security in Nigeria. Does this work? Anyone like to comment on this one?
It's simple. And, yeah,
yes.
concrete.
Definitely, yes. It is simple and it's concrete, that we have a short sentence. There's not too many modifiers in there. We're talking about land reform specifically. And hopefully it'll be easier to remember and be able to pass on. Also, we're talking about food security. So this is a pressing and important subject, and it's right there. It's right there. It's something that you know that your policymakers are going to care about, is ensuring food security for their population. So as soon as you get these kind of key problems identified in your key messages, and that you're offering a solution, that's got to be attractive to them. Another one. Enforcing the 2016 Land Act within communities will help more women make decisions over inputs and harvests. Is this a good one? Anyone like to comment on this one?
For me, I think it qualifies the quality of a good message in the sense that it shows the action that can be taken, the expected outcome, which is land enforcement of Land Act, and that can contribute to decision making among women. So for me, I think I can catch it quickly.
Yes, I think that you're right, that it's specific, and it's quite simple as well. It's concrete and quite simple. The one point that I think is perhaps a little bit weaker is that, yes, having women making decisions over inputs and harvests, generally speaking, that sounds like a good thing, but I don't necessarily know that that's an urgent problem that needs solving, in the same way that not having food security sounds urgent. This would take, I mean, it depends who you're talking to, but it would take speaking to someone who knows already that when women do not have decision-making power over inputs and harvests, that causes other key problems, for example. So that's the only slight weakness. But this is research, this is real life. Just because I'm trying to say, oh, we've got a nice catchy phrase, doesn't mean that it's going to reflect your research, your analysis very well. Your research is complex. It's a matter of trying to find the simplest, most attractive and most concrete way of presenting what you found. And we understand that there will be compromises. Some findings lend themselves to very neat key messages. Okay. So, okay, moving on.
Just one question. I have one question, Jenny, about the last example.
Yes.
So basically what you're saying is that the formulation here, when you talk about, well, the mention of the problem, so the decision-making power issue, you would have to adapt it depending on who you're talking to. If you're talking to someone responsible for women's affairs or gender policy, then this person would know, and you could use that formulation because it would address this issue in the way that they understand it.
Yes.
Okay, exactly. But if you're talking to someone who's worried about agricultural policy, then you'd have to present the result of increasing decision-making power amongst women.
Exactly. So you'd say maybe enforcing the Land Act within communities will improve food security.
Right. Excellent. Okay. Thank you.
Great.
Great. Thank you.
But this is something that we'll look at a bit more tomorrow about how to adapt your messages when you're talking to different people, just in sort of very broad terms. For this, I wanted to really look at quite general rules as an introduction to the idea of key messages that are going to work for multiple audiences.
Yeah. It was very effective illustrations. Thank you.
I hope the the team members also feel that way. So we're going to look a bit about the structure, about how to organize your key messages, remembering what I said right at the start, that you want to think of your objectives and prioritize accordingly. So in persuasive communications, there is what is called the pyramid principle. And so you start at the top with the point that you most want remembered. Then you'll make your argument, and then you can provide evidence. So this is important because you're likely to have more than one bit of information that you want to convey, and exactly how you're going to organize them depends who you're talking to, and like really always it depends who you're talking to, but it also, like, there might be other factors to consider. So I will go into that more tomorrow, I promise. I keep saying that. But for now, I will try and give some examples of how this would work in a sort of more general sense. So this is an overall diagram that explains a bit how it could work. So you'll notice up here, we have a little bit of background, in fact. So we're not going to focus on this right now, just to say that this information is for before you get to structuring your key messages, that you'll want to grab the attention of your audience. So for example, something, for example, in a policy brief, or if you're giving a slide presentation, this would be your title. If you wrote a blog article, this would be your headline. It's something that's just going to attract attention generally into perhaps raise a question. Here it suggests a complicating event that creates tension. So if it could be, what can be done to empower Nigeria's women? Like, oh, what's going on here? We'll look more about that tomorrow, especially when we're talking about the policy brief. But to get back to explaining your key messages, we want your recommendation, at the top of, whether it could be the top of your policy brief, like that's how we structure policy briefs, but it could also be your first slide if you're giving a policy, a presentation. It could just be the first thing that you say in a meeting, that you ask a question and then you come in with your recommendation. You're saying what you want your target audience to do, thinking about your objectives. Then the next line down, this is your supporting logic. This will be based on the conclusions from your analysis. And underneath, you will use your findings to support this. So I have taken a PEP project and done this exactly. So the recommendation: implement land reform to increase women's access to agricultural land and can improve food security. Sorry, that's not super good English, but you understand what I want to say here. I would, if I was presenting this to a policymaker, I would tighten up that sentence. But we're saying implement land reform, increase women's access to agricultural land, improve food security. That's our recommendation. Then this is based on our conclusions, which the conclusion being increasing women farmers' access to land is the most effective and economically efficient policy option for achieving the goals of the National Food Security Programme. And that is based on our findings. Out of the available policy options, increasing women farmers' access to land would increase agricultural productivity the most, lead to the most economic growth, GDP at market prices, and significantly increase wages for rural households and hired female labour. When you're talking about this, perhaps you would want to include some statistics or something in your facts. This is completely based on your work, your analysis, your research, and you need to underline, highlight the fact that this comes from your empirical analysis. So as you can see, we don't need to say everything in your recommendation. We just need enough to keep the reader reading or the listener listening, because each layer brings more detail than the one before, and it bolsters the one before. So whether you are sharing this as a written document or a spoken presentation, or even just a conversation, people, unfortunately, for when you want to convey information, pay the most attention and best retain the first bit of information they receive. So this is why you want to start strong. You want to choose your first message very carefully. Quite often they might retain the last thing you say. So, especially in spoken, so you might want to summarize as well. But the pyramid principle is very useful for any persuasive communication, but particularly written. The nice thing about it as well is that if they have it, whoever you're talking to, if they have the document on their desk, for example, they can just pick it up and see straight away the key points and go, oh, right, yes, I remember this one. So this isn't the only way to organize your key messages. Another way of formulating them is called the AIDA, or AIDA, Rule of Marketing and Advertising, because you are trying to sell your policy messages. So what is AIDA? It is A, for attract the attention of your audience. I, raise interest in the message or evidence that you are providing. D, encourage a desire to act or to know more. And then A is prompt an action, because you are presenting a solution. So this can help you structure your text, and it can help you choose which words will best convey particular ideas. Of course, there is no one-size-fits-all formula, so you need to think about your objectives. What story are you telling, and how can this lead to action? And what action specifically are you asking them to take? So you'll need to use your expertise and your knowledge of your target audience and the policy context that you're working within to be able to adapt this to your situation. So we're going to have a look at an example from an earlier PEP project from Uruguay. Their findings were that minimum wage policy increased wages for domestic workers, but the policy meant that there was more migration from the formal sector to the informal sector. And the general recommendation was to implement compliance measures. So let's have a look at how we can use the AIDA structure to represent or to sell these messages. So here we have three short points. Minimum wage policy means more domestic workers move to the informal sector. Attention. Minimum wage policy, when you're talking to policy makers, is likely to attract their attention, and we're talking about the informal sector. So this is something that policymakers will be interested in, because of course the informal sector are not, they're not paying taxes, they're not paying, and they're not receiving social benefits. So normally you would think that people in government would want more people to be in the formal sector. So hopefully this would attract their attention. Then we have new findings to show that compliance measures such as inspections and awareness can offset these effects. Oh, there is the possibility of solving something here. I would like to know more. We have created some desire here. And then minimum wage policies need to include provisions for working conditions inspections and awareness campaigns. So we're asking the person who's reading this to include these provisions or to recommend that compliance measures are included. So I hope you can see really the way that you can split this message into these different points. So let's try another one. This one's from Nigeria, the same that we were looking at earlier. Does the AIDA structure work for this project? So we have increasing women's access to agricultural land can improve food security in Nigeria. Oh, yes, please, we want to improve food security. You have my attention. New findings. What are these new findings? Show that when women have access to more land, it promotes effective, equitable, and efficient agricultural development. Yes. This is what we want to do. We want agricultural development. Please tell me more. Land reform is vital. Oh, yes, I'm in the committee for land reform. I can do something about this. There you go. You have your attention, interest, desire, and action. Now it's your turn. Can you put these statements from a project in Malawi into the AIDA order? So I'll just read them through and then I'll ask you to tell me which one's attention, which one's interest, which one's desire, which one's action. So the top point currently says enforcing the 2016 Land Act in communities will boost women's decision-making power. The next one, Incorporating women-focused measures into the policy can help increase gender equality and ensure the success of this policy. Third one, if Malawi's women continue to be disempowered, food insecurity and poverty will persist. Last one, new findings show the farm input subsidy improved agricultural productivity but reduced women's empowerment. So, can I have a suggestion for which one is attention? Please just turn on your microphone and let me know which of these 4 points is attracting attention.
See?
Yeah. Please go ahead.
I'm thinking C. Maybe C.
So the third one, you mean?
Yeah. The third one.
I would agree. Why do I say this? It's because we're talking about insecurity and poverty. Food insecurity and poverty. These are very important problems, things that policymakers are continually striving to reduce, to solve even. So if you're saying you're identifying a very specific problem and saying that this is going to carry on if we don't do something about this specific area, I think that is going to attract their attention. So what might raise their interest in finding out a bit more?
The last one.
The last one. So yes, I would agree. New findings. So we've got, yes, they improve agricultural productivity, but they're reducing women's empowerment. Oh dear. What's going to incite desire to know more?
The second one.
The second one, I would agree. Incorporating women-focused measures can increase gender equality and ensure the success of this policy. Yes, please tell me more about your findings. I want my policy to be successful. Which leaves us, thank you very much, with action being enforcing the 2016 Land Act in communities. So hopefully that has given you an idea of the type of information from your project that you can use, how you could structure that. This rule is really useful for when you want to inspire action, which is what we've been saying from the beginning, that you're asking people to do something. It is suitable for formal tools, such as your policy brief, when you do your national policy conference, and informal tools, such as an elevator pitch, a social media post, a chance meeting kind of thing. We will talk more about tools tomorrow. And I just wanted to introduce you to the AIDA structure so that this is something that you can refer to as you go forwards. So tomorrow we're going to talk about strategizing your communications, creating an effective dissemination package. So this includes choosing the content that you're going to share, which tools you're going to use to share it and through which channels, and all of that will depend on your audience, as I keep saying. And also we're going to look at adapting and visualizing your content. First, partly for different audience, but also for different tools and channels, which is also linked to audience. because it always is. And we're going to specifically look at how to do a PEP policy brief, because that is coming up for you very soon. Marjorie, do you have anything that you would like to add about tomorrow?
Not necessarily, no, I think that sums it. There is the exercise,
Yeah.
the hands-on that we might want to, I don't know, I guess you were getting there,
Yes.
but really tomorrow is about concluding with, so that to help you really create a package and tools that would be useful. And the policy brief, that session is important because it will save a lot of time in editorial review. People who follow the instructions or the guidelines that we provide in these sessions can produce their policy briefs much more effectively and quickly. And Jenny has a lot of experience with that.
Yes. I will like you so much more if you follow the instructions. So much more.
Right. So yeah, go ahead, continue with the exercise.
Okay, so using the same links as yesterday, perhaps someone else can put these in the chat again. We're going to ask you, we're not going to have breakout rooms here, we're just going to ask you to, within your teams, look at slide 3 of the slides for your project and review your key policy messages. So, based on what you've seen today, do they speak to actual policy needs? If not, clearly you are going to have to revise them. We also want you to rewrite them to make sure that they are simple, attractive, and concrete, and put them in an order, a hierarchy, to achieve the greatest effect.
Yeah, I want to specify I saw that, well, several of you have not yet started the exercise. And it's something that I think that if you do now, we're going to give you, you can just do it on your own time. Ideally, I would like to be able to download these slides probably by Monday. I can wait until Monday, but do it on your own time with your team. If you do this exercise, I think it will really help you see if you have assimilated the knowledge of the workshop, and if you need help or support to work on your policy messaging of your dissemination package. And all of you there, you're about to, if you haven't started already, do disseminate your findings and talk about your findings with the policy users. So this is the right time for you to do this. If you do it together, then it's more effective. It allows you to talk about it, consider if you have questions, and tomorrow will still be time for you to ask these questions to us. Of course, you can always reach us by email as well, but if we are on site and we can have a breakout room and talk to you directly, it could be very helpful. So I would really strongly suggest that we we will I've sent the links to the slides by email yesterday. Just access your slides with your team, start the exercise, and let us know, and focus on slide 3 with your key policy messages, and try to do what Jenny has taught us today. And if you need help, we can help you right away, and it will speed things up for your dissemination package.